Spring 1944. A German Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot banks his aircraft over the English countryside somewhere south of London and squints through his camera viewfinder at what lies below. Fields. Roads. A railway line. And then there. Dozens of tanks, arranged in precise military formation across a broad, flat field. Sherman tanks, by the look of them, American-built, the kind that would form the armored spearhead of any serious Allied invasion. He photographs them carefully, checks his fuel, and turns for home. His report will reach Wehrmacht intelligence within hours. The armored concentration is real. The build-up is happening. The invasion is coming, and it appears to be aimed exactly where the Germans have always expected it. Every single tank in that field is made of rubber. They weigh less than a suitcase. 2 men can carry one under their arms. A bicycle pump can inflate one in under 10 minutes. And at that moment, in fields and marshalling yards across southeast England, there are hundreds more just like them: rubber lorries, rubber artillery pieces, rubber landing craft bobbing gently on the Thames estuary, all of it arranged with sufficient precision to fool a camera at altitude, sufficient density to suggest a force capable of crossing the Channel and tearing through the Atlantic Wall. None of it will ever fire a shot. All of it will change the course of the war. The story of Britain's ghost army, the inflatable, the illusory, the deliberately ridiculous made strategically lethal, is one of the most audacious deceptions in the history of warfare. It is also one of the least understood. Most people who know anything about D-Day have heard the name Operation Overlord. Fewer have heard the name Operation Bodyguard. And fewer still understand the full scale of the physical, logistical, and theatrical effort that went into making the Germans look in entirely the wrong direction on the most consequential morning of the 20th century. This is that story. To understand why Britain needed an army of ghosts, it is necessary to understand the scale of the problem that faced Allied planners in the winter of 1943. The liberation of Western Europe was no longer a question of whether but of when and where. The Americans were fully committed. The material was flowing. The men were training. What nobody had solved was the central strategic problem that would determine whether the invasion succeeded or failed within its first 72 hours. The Germans had more men, more armor, and more defensive fortification along the French coast than the Allies could reasonably expect to overcome unless the Germans could be persuaded to keep a substantial portion of their best forces somewhere else on the day the landings actually happened. The Pas de Calais was the obvious invasion point. Everyone knew it. It was the narrowest crossing of the Channel, barely 34 kilometers, 21 miles, at the Strait of Dover, and it offered the most direct route into the industrial heartland of Germany. The Germans knew the Allies knew it. Allied planners knew the Germans knew they knew it. And yet Normandy, the actual chosen landing site, offered its own advantages: longer beaches, less concentrated defenses, the element of genuine surprise. The challenge was not simply to land at Normandy. It was to land at Normandy while convincing the Germans that the real invasion was still coming at Calais, and to keep them convinced of this for long enough after the Normandy landings that they would hold their reserve panzer divisions back rather than committing them to push the Allied beachhead into the sea in those critical first days. By late 1943, German strength in France included the formidable 15th Army, stationed in and around the Pas de Calais with specific orders to repel the main Allied crossing. If those divisions could be kept pinned in place watching, waiting, certain that the blow had not yet fallen, the Normandy landings would have the time they needed to consolidate. Everything depended on making the fiction more convincing than the reality. And the fiction needed props. The solution to the problem of how to build a fake army came from several directions simultaneously. Within Britain, the responsibility for physical deception, the actual construction and deployment of dummy equipment, fell primarily to 2 organizations operating in parallel. The first was a unit of the Royal Engineers with the deliberately dull designation of No. 3 Camouflage Unit, working in coordination with a civilian theatrical and design community that had been quietly recruited into wartime deception work since 1940. The second was the London Controlling Section, the strategic deception body that sat above all deception operations and coordinated the overall narrative that the physical props were meant to support. The inflatable tanks themselves were the product of a collaboration between British military engineers and several civilian manufacturers, most notably the Dunlop Rubber Company, which already possessed the industrial infrastructure and material science expertise to produce large-scale inflatable objects to precise dimensional specifications. The brief was exacting. Each inflatable Sherman tank had to be dimensionally accurate to within a reasonable tolerance of the real vehicle. The M4 Sherman stood approximately 2.7 meters, 8 feet 10 inches, tall, was 5.9 meters, 19 feet 4 inches, long, and 2.6 meters, 8 feet 7 inches, wide. The inflatable version had to replicate these proportions convincingly enough to deceive aerial photography at altitudes of between 3,000 and 6,000 meters, roughly 10,000 to 20,000 feet, the standard operational range for Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. The material used was a rubberized canvas composite, similar in construction to the material used in large industrial inflatable structures and, indeed, in some forms of early life RAF technology. The panels were cut to shape, vulcanized at the seams for airtightness, and fitted with inflation valves at discrete points that could be connected to standard hand pumps or, where speed was required, small compressor units. A fully deflated tank could be folded into a bundle roughly the size of a large kit bag, approximately 90 cm by 60 cm, 35 by 24 inches, when tightly rolled, and could be transported in the back of a standard 3-ton lorry. A trained 2-man team could unroll, position, and fully inflate a tank to operational appearance in approximately 8 to 12 minutes. A section of 6 men could deploy an entire armored squadron of 12 vehicles in under 2 hours. Crucially, the inflatables were not simply parked in fields and left. The deception required movement, change, evidence of activity. Vehicles were repositioned between reconnaissance overflight windows. Tracks were created in soft ground using weighted rollers dragged behind real lorries. Wireless traffic was generated nearby to suggest the communications signature of a genuine armored formation. Petrol cans, ammunition boxes, and tent structures, all real, were placed around the inflatable vehicles to add texture to the scene at lower altitudes. The entire enterprise was, in the most literal sense, a stage production mounted for an audience of one, the Luftwaffe camera. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There is considerably more still to come. The most significant operational deployment of the Ghost Army concept was in direct service of Operation Fortitude, the deception component of Operation Bodyguard, which was itself the overarching Allied strategic deception plan for 1944. Fortitude South, the element directly concerned with convincing the Germans that the main invasion would strike the Pas de Calais, relied on the existence of a fictional formation called the 1st United States Army Group Fusag, nominally commanded by General George S. Patton, whose reputation as an aggressive armored commander made him, in German eyes, the obvious choice to lead any serious invasion force. Fusag had no real soldiers. What it had was inflatable tanks concentrated in Kent and Essex, dummy landing craft moored on the Thames and along the southeast coast, an elaborate wireless deception program generating the signal traffic of a genuine army group headquarters, and a network of double agents, most famously the Spaniard Juan Pujol Garque, known to the British as Garbo, feeding fabricated intelligence reports to the German Abwehr that confirmed every element of the fiction. In the fields around Folkestone and in the marshalling areas near Dover, inflatable Sherman sat in formation, repositioned twice weekly, their rubber flanks catching the morning light in ways that a camera at altitude could not distinguish from steel. German assessments of Allied strength in southeast England, compiled by Fremdheer West, the Wehrmacht's Western Intelligence Branch, consistently overestimated the forces concentrated opposite Calais by a factor that, according to post-war analysis of captured documents, ran as high as 2 to 1. They were, in part, counting rubber. It is worth comparing the British approach to physical deception with what other powers were doing in the same period, because the contrast is instructive. The Germans had their own history of deception operations, most notably the use of dummy aircraft on airfields to absorb RAF bombing attacks, a practice employed with moderate effectiveness from 1940 onwards. German dummy aircraft, however, were predominantly static wooden or canvas structures without the dimensional precision or the supporting deception infrastructure, the wireless traffic, the agent network, the repositioning routine that made the British inflatable program so effective. They were props without a play. The Americans, through their 23rd Headquarters Special Troops universally known as the Ghost Army, deployed a comparable inflatable and sonic deception capability in the European theater from June 1944 onwards, operating primarily in support of tactical rather than strategic deception. The American unit was approximately 1,100 men strong and operated inflatable tanks, artillery, and vehicles alongside sound trucks capable of broadcasting recordings of armored movement at volumes audible several kilometers away. Their work was tactically effective at several points, including operations near the Siegfried Line in late 1944. The critical difference was scale and timing. The British strategic deception effort, operating months before the Americans arrived, had already achieved the most consequential single act of military deception of the entire war before the Ghost Army fired up its first sound truck. The actual impact of Operation Fortitude and its inflatable components is one of the most studied and, in some respects, still contested questions of Second World War historiography. What is not contested is the bare fact: on 6 June 1944, the day of the Normandy landings, the German 15th Army remained in the Pas de Calais. It did not move. Rommel had available to him, within reach of the Normandy beachhead, armored reserves that could and by many post-war analyses should have driven the Allied landings back into the sea in the critical first 48 hours. They did not move because Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command remained convinced, even after the Normandy landings had begun, that those landings were a feint and the real blow was still coming at Calais. That conviction held for weeks. By the time it collapsed, the Allies were ashore in strength. The beachhead was secure. How much of that conviction was sustained by inflatable rubber, and how much by the double agent network and the wireless deception, is impossible to disentangle. Deception does not work through any single component. It works through the cumulative weight of evidence, each piece reinforcing the next, until the target believes not because he has been told what to believe but because everything he can see confirms what he already suspects. The inflatable tanks were one thread in a web. But without the physical evidence that aerial photography could confirm, the web would have had holes that German intelligence might eventually have found. Surviving examples of British inflatable deception equipment are rare. The Imperial War Museum holds records and some photographic documentation. A small number of American Ghost Army inflatables were preserved by veterans and can be seen in private collections in the United States. The rubber and canvas materials used in the British program were not built to survive, and most were either deflated and stored after 1944 or simply deteriorated in field conditions. What survives is largely the paper record, the intelligence assessments, the reconnaissance photographs, the post-war German testimony that tells us, with considerable certainty, that the deception worked. Return, then, to that German reconnaissance pilot banking over the English countryside. He has done his job correctly. He has photographed what is there. He has reported accurately what his camera saw. He is not wrong. He is simply looking at a very good lie, arranged with extraordinary care by people who understood that in a certain kind of war, the most powerful weapon is not the one that fires but the one that makes the enemy fire in the wrong direction. Those rubber tanks never crossed the Channel. They never fired a shell or took a hit or liberated a single French village. They sat in fields in Kent and Essex and they were, by any objective measure, absurd. 2 men and a bicycle pump. Rubberized canvas folded into a kit bag. And they helped keep an entire German army standing on the wrong beach. On the morning of 6 June 1944, while the 15th Army watched the Strait of Dover for an invasion that was never going to come, real men were dying on real beaches 60 kilometers away and surviving, because the Ghost Army had done its work. Fiction held. The beachhead held. The war turned. 2 men. A bicycle pump. A German army that never moved. That is what a very good lie can do.